Welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about world building, specifically one world in particular, that being of Neil Gaiman's Sandman. I don't know if you've been living under a rock, but it is kind of big right now, and personally speaking, it's been a cornerstone of my writing and stuff for nigh 30 years. I think it's been out for 30 years, and when I was 18 I got to meet Neil Gaiman and spend several hours with him over several days, and it was a huge impact on me as a writer and as an individual. So he's always had a special place in my heart, which is why I'm overjoyed that Sandman is on TV, streaming at any rate. And it took 30 years, but we're finally there, and so today we are going to discuss the world building, the plot, the characters, and adaptations, and how they all work together to make a really cool thing. I'm Matt, and once a week I break down world building techniques, tricks, and tips, usually by building a world on the fly, but today we're doing our third, I think, case study on Sandman, and I hope you'll join me to discuss the world building. Firstly, now that we're back, I've just hit 400 followers, and I'm very excited about that. I never expected that many people to care about world building, let alone my own take on it, so thanks everyone for showing up. Yeah, and with that in mind, let's look at Sandman and Neil Gaiman's stuff. I've been discussing with a lot of friends lately, people who are just watching it for the first time, who haven't encountered Sandman in all of its 30 years of history. By the way, this poster of one of my favorite things, I got it in Boston at the 20-year anniversary of Sandman. I had to get it special because they weren't for sale at the time, so I had to buy it under the table. Anyways, it's really cool. I really like it. All the characters. Yeah, it's 10 years old now. It's always hung on my wall. Yeah, also my other favorite thing is an autograph by one Mr. Gaiman. Yeah, he doesn't do those anymore. Side note, I talked to Mahir at Fantasy Book Critic a while back about meeting him and all that, and I have a link in the notes if you want to look at that. Anyways, so as I was saying, I've discussed with people who haven't encountered Sandman before, and a lot of also my writer friends, and we came to the conclusion that, well, I came to the conclusion that Sandman's world building, Gaiman's world building in this can be summed up as soft as warm butter. On the hard to soft scale, hard being the audience understands it, soft scale being that the audience doesn't understand what's going on in the world, it's soft. It is really, really soft. And today we're going to explain how he gets away with it. How was he able to make a world that was so soft where we don't understand the rules, and yet still have a wonderful comic that's been around for forever, as well as one of the top shows. I think it was #1 in 18 countries at the same time. So yeah, let's look at that. Firstly, though, we're going to have to look at how it's an adaptation. Adaptations are really important, and something that I focus on as a screenwriter who's had to adapt some existing properties before. This is something that Mark J.P. Wolf, in his book on world building, the textbook, refers to as transmedial. As something that exists in more than one medium. So yeah, like, you know, it was a comic, it's a video game, it's a regular RPG, and it's a TV show or a movie based on those things. And in my book series, I looked at 5 exemplars: Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Wars, and Avatar: Last Airbender, and I looked at them, and one of the components of why I consider them exemplars was they were transmedial. There's some others that should have been on there, maybe should have been on the list, that didn't make my exemplar. The Witcher, Discworld, some of those. Well, The Witcher, for one thing, didn't make it, even though it technically might, because one of the other things I've looked at is if the world could support timelines that were not the original. So, you know, Conan, you know, doesn't really count because the world exists just for Conan's adventures. I mean, Red Sonja's sort of in it, but it's not quite the same. So, yeah, anyways, like, you know, The Witcher, again, is for an eponymous hero who is in it, The Witcher. There is a Netflix series, it's a prequel, even though he does show up in it, but that's what I kind of mean about the world needs to support more than one storyline in different ages, The Hobbit and, you know, Frodo's Lord of the Rings stuff, but I'm getting away with it. So back to adaptations. Comics are notoriously good for adaptations, as all the Marvel movies that are out right now, and it's partially because they have built-in storyboards. I mean, you can look at, like, well, this is what it visually looks at. writing and books, are not a visual medium, which TV and plays and that kind of thing are. Comics are also a visual medium. So you can do things in comics that you can't in books, which is to explain things, to get inside the narrator's head, even though you can in comics. And yeah, anyways, we're going to look at that in just a second. People like adapting comic books because I think Sin City was famous for he actually took a picture of it and put it there and had the people stand in the picture to recreate the frames of the shot. That's somewhat of an extreme, but Sandman has been around for 30 years and now we're just seeing it. So let's kind of look at why. And I think part of that is because it is such a hard genre to pin down. It is grabbing from everything. When people ask what is it, I say it's epic urban fantasy, which is kind of true. I mean, it is epic in its scope. It's giant, huge. It goes on for thousands of years in the past. It goes backwards but it takes place mostly in the modern times. But it involves the entire world and involves myths going, Satan shows up, all the fairy kingdoms, it's cross-cultural. And it's really hard to pin down what it is, especially the first two, books in the series, I would say are highly, these are old ones, highly influenced by horror. But I'd say the horror goes away as the series goes on. And what is it? Well, it's everything, and it's a mishmash, and not a mishmash, that sounds like it's did something wrong, but it's a mixing of all these different things, from myth all the way to, urban fantasy as we know it now. And so I think that's part of why it took so long to get to screen, because it was hard to put into a box. But back to the adaptations and how they did it, one of the first things that sticks out is, in the comic, I won't get it all right. We start right with, the guy going to Burgess's house, which is sort of how it started in the movie, except, and this is one of the major changes, it starts off with a prologue with Dream telling you what is Dream, who he is, and a little bit of extra stuff. And prologues are, fallen out of favor, but they are quite necessary, like info dumps, or quite useful, I should say. But the old screenwriting trip and the adage holds true that if you're going to do a prologue, you do it before the through line starts. You have in Lord of the Rings, in the movie adaptation, here is the ring, and this is the problem, and this is what we're going to have to try to solve. In Star Wars, you have the crawl, and this is what's going wrong. Harry Potter again starts with the prologue of these bad things have happened, and kids been stuck somewhere. So something to keep in mind, which is why they did this and why they could get away with it. Prologue before the story starts, though it is interesting that they did bring it through to the story itself. Dream is now, side note, there's going to be spoilers. Definitely spoilers. The rest of this episode, most of the 90% of this episode is going to be as if you consider it if you have watched the series. Let's look at it, because we're going to have to look at the plot and characters, and I'm going to make some mild references to the book series, the written series itself. Last few minutes are going to be spoilers for the series itself, so cut out early if you don't want to see that, but the rest of this should be fine if you've only seen the series, if you've only seen the first season. All right, where was I? Oh yeah, so yes, they brought in the Corinthian early, and this is another thing that I particularly like in writing, is to introduce the villain in the prologue before you bring in the hero. Star Wars is great about that. You see Darth Vader just wrecking shit, and then you bring Luke in, and you're like, oh, how is Luke going to stop it? Same thing with not Harry Potter, was it Lord of the Rings? Hey, there's the ring and Sauron, and now a hobbit's gonna have to solve it. Oh wow, how's he gonna pull this off? So they did that. They brought in the Corinthian. I don't think they even explained what Dream was doing when he was caught originally in the comic, but they did a really good idea in this of streamlining it and bringing it all together. That's one of Sanderson's points in Magic Systems, and is great for world building, streamlining. Another thing they did in the adaptation was increase Matthew's presence, and this was actually very clever in my opinion, because now Matthew goes with them into hell, and it becomes part of the storyline. Matthew, like, you're not going to leave me in hell, and that inspires Dream during the battle, which was kind of cool, but he wasn't there. And this was a really great thing that they did, because Dream is kind of a black box. You never really know what he's thinking, and and throughout the whole series itself, you never really know what he's doing or what he's planning. They threw Matthew in to go to hell, and that is a great example of soft imparting. Imparting is when the author just tells you something, and but soft impart is the kind of, as you know, Bob, or where a character is ignorant and the other character tells them something. You can review that in looking at imparting versus deducting, and soft and hard versions of that. But this is the classic Hermione of I'm the ignorant Harry. Well, here's Hermione to tell you what the world building details are. So it's info dumping, but it's more palatable. That's, in my opinion, why they added Matthew to that, and it works really well in that sense. Hey, Editor Me from several days later. I just realized something. The casting of Patton Oswalt was really, really well done for Matthew, and I think that he just found his niche of sidekick animal between this one, Ratatouille, and Happy. Also, he is in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and was voice of MODOK in that show, so that's four Marvel properties, four comic properties that he's been a part of, which is a lot, but that puts him in second place to Chris Evans, who I think has 6 of them now. So anyways, oddly enough, well, not oddly enough, great choice for that one. He did a great job as Matthew. Also in the adaptation, they streamlined some stuff, and and I think it worked out pretty well. Like Sandman is very, very sprawling in its comic form, and they tightened it up, they streamlined it again. Things like having Lucifer as the person, as the individual, I guess, entity that has the contest of wills with Sandman instead of Corazon, I think his name was, which is what it was in the comic, which will come into play in book 4, by the way. So like, how are they going to switch that up? That was good because it made Lucifer more involved in the story, which is again going to come into play in book 4. So yeah, it made sense of Lucifer's like, I'm going to destroy you. Like, yeah, until that day. So that part of the streamlining was really well. This is plot-based streamlining, I think. Little to do about the world building itself. And by increasing the Corinthian as well, they made a villain for the first season. Corinthian doesn't really show up until book 2, I don't think. Don't quote me on that. But doesn't become a driver in the story until book 2, which is. So again, good idea for them to make a villain. Sandman needs something to fight against, and by increasing Corinthian's strength, made Sandman more of an underdog, even though Sandman was pretty much, Dream was kind of an underdog in this without the ruby and such. They also subbed out some characters that are kind of interesting. Constantine being the most obvious, where it's Lady Constantine, I forgot if they gave her a name, which is kind of interesting. Brute and Glob were the 2 of the villains that the Dream's nightmares that got away in book 2, and I can't remember the character's name, the former Nightmare who wants to become a Dream, that they replaced that with. There were also other ones that got removed entirely, like Martian Manhunter and Etrigan. Those probably because they didn't have the rights to, which circles back to Constantine, that, Constantine already has a show, or had a show, and showed up in the Arrowverse and that kind of thing. Has had a movie adaptation, and, I'm sure they didn't have the rights to it, so they put in a female Constantine and, got away with it. Side note, I asked, when I did meet Neil Gaiman and I was 18, and one of my favorite books was Books of Magic, and Constantine's in it, and then Constantine shows up in this one, and I was like, wow, thinking that Constantine was Gaiman's creation. I was like, hey, can you tell me does he really have magic? What's up with that? And being the great gentleman that he was like, he's not really mine to work with. You'd have to ask Alan Moore what he can really do. And I'm like, oh yeah, Alan Moore. I'll go do that real quick. Anyways, which is one of the things that we need to remember about Sandman and its time and place and everything, was that in the comic, the original version, Gaiman was working with existing characters in a universe, was drawing also from myths and trying to get that right. And so, certain things like Martian Manhunter and such could be, or Etrigan could be in there in the comic version, but not in the adaptation of it because, getting the money to have all of that. Also, I think, and Lucifer, the show, is a spin-off of Lucifer from book 4, which is this one, which is my favorite. Well, maybe my favorite. Anyways, so yeah, people have like, how did you kind of square it that one Lucifer is existing in one universe of a spin-off of one of his shows, and then we have another version. So it kind of makes sense that they would switch out the genders on that Lucifer, who did look a lot more like the comic version. What's her name? Brienne of Tarth. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the actress's name. Anyways, so yeah, switching out Constantine and Lucifer makes sense. But a lot of people are kind of upset about other things like, oh, it's so woke, that they're switching genders and adding ethnicities and adding, inclusiveness and, and I would argue that Sandman was always woke. Like from the beginning, there's always been, there was always gay and gay representation in it. I mean, just right off the bat. I mean, even Burgess's son in it, is gay, and that's in the first, first story. And he's kind of a villain, but you feel sympathy for him, so it's not just, homosexuals as villains, as could be argued for the Corinthian. And there were people of a lot of different skin tones, a lot of ethnicities, a lot of cultures that are represented in it, and that was, again, way ahead of its time. I remember reading it as like 17-year-old the first time, and like, there's a lot of gay stuff, and I came from a Texas, very conservative background, and so my excuse to that. And I remember being very uncomfortable, like reading these characters, especially in the 5th book, where there's whole team of lesbians and trans characters, and it was good for me to be uncomfortable by this. I mean, it did open my eyes to different views and stuff, and that is one of the signs of great literature. So congratulations on that. Congratulations, Sandman, of always being woke. So yeah, and also keep in mind that Neil Gaiman is the executive producer on this. So, these changes that he makes, that he feels okay with it. It's his call to make. A death being black when she shows up, not really a big deal. Like they're, representations of stuff. Dream was black when he encountered his ex, whose name I'm blanking on, in hell for a while. And, and in the comic, he's actually, Martian for a little bit when he encounters Martian Manhunter, because, there's a representation of Dream, an endless kind of thing. I think Death was Chinese in one of in her story, High Cost of Living maybe. So yeah, there are things, everyone sees the characters as they're supposed to be. So again, wokeness makes sense in it. One of the other things that confused some of my friends and enraged some of the other people I know is how willing Gaiman is to leave the through line. I think the biggest example is the diner episode. And so even though, sometimes they took things like the Death storyline with Hobgadlane and meeting up with Death and, combine them into 2. Like the whole first season is actually the first 2 books. They spent a whole episode on the diner, which was really one of the most terrifying things I remember reading as a kid. Like, this is frightening. And so it deserved a whole episode for. Yeah, and that is again part of Gaiman's style. When we first meet Dream in the comic, like, we don't see him for like halfway through the comic, and then like he thinks no, like that's it. Like it is a really long time before Dream speaks and takes action. It is all about the stuff happening around him. And maybe it's just because it's an older, comic coming out of the horror tradition, that it could get away with this back then, and then a pretty active, pretty true adaptation of it later. And I also think that he can get away with it because of how tightly plotted these are. All of these things that you saw do come back into the story. Little characters that you saw, minor characters that you saw in the first season are going to be huge later on. And even, I think Martin Tinbones, is that his name? I'm going to see if I can find some video of him. Like Barbie and Martin Tinbones, they're going to be important later, and you saw them already. And, the end of the series is already highlighted. The things that will bring it about and conclude it have already been introduced, and you probably don't know it yet if you haven't read the series. But back to the world building. One thing they kept saying throughout it is the rules. The rules, the rules, the rules. You know, I remember he was walking with Matthew in hell, and he was like, "Oh, there's rules to this, Matthew. You know, like I can't do this because of the rules." And Lucifer says the same thing, like the rules. And like, what are these rules? Like, what rules? Can you spell them out to me? I remember there's one bit in the comic itself where Sandman makes Desire swear by the first circle, and she says, they say, you know, again, like there's always been androgynous, I guess, hermaphroditic. Anyway, you know, anyways, Dream makes Desire swear by the first circle. Yes, oh yes, I swear by the first circle and by the other side of the sky and by the sword, and then that. They never explain that. That sums up the world building to me. Entity of like, hey, we're making references to things and you're never going to know what those mean. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the audience because the characters know the rules. This is the important part, and why I think that one of the major reasons that the world building can be so soft and yet this can still be so popular is that the characters know the rules. The characters know the rules, act accordingly, and this makes author authority, that the author knows the rules because the characters do. And this is kind of like technobabble, where like you come in and like, oh well, da 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 da, you know, the character spouts off a whole bunch of stuff that sounds fancy and they never try to explain it. It's just to show that the character has authority in something. Like, this is the scientist, Data and Geordi can fix all these things because they said a lot of big words. Like, okay, like technobabble, great. This is kind of authorial technobabble to make you know, their authority. It's also a perfect example of soft deduction in that the characters, again, know the rules, they act accordingly, and you figure it out based on the characters, you know, by what the characters have done. That said, and this is like Hemingway. He mentions about that. You can, as long as the author knows something, you can cut, and the audience will still figure it out because the author is so sure of it. But with all that said, they still, in the world building, and this because of plot, set things up in the show that were not in the comic. Mainly Gregory getting absorbed by Dream. This was something I can see it happening retroactively. They had an event that needed to happen. They kind of needed to explain it, and they brought it into a character moment with seeing what Dream was willing to sacrifice, and in so doing, set up what they needed to for the ruby and it going wrong, and you know, it being destroyed for him to reabsorb all of his power. This is Chekhov's gun. This is retroactive Chekhov's gun, where they went back and added something to make something later make sense. So back to the soft world building. The world building doesn't really matter in Sandman. That sounds really weird, especially for the King of Dreams and stories, and this really weird, random, not random, but kind of random world where anything can happen. It's because the world building doesn't need its rules. It can be soft as butter because the story is all about character, and character. Like magic systems, as we looked at, if you should review, if you'd like to look, there's window dressing, which is the softest form of magic. And that's really just to like create problems and to make the world feel mysterious and wonderful and amazing. And it can be used effectively in the story. It can solve things as long as it's all about character growth, because soft magic, soft world building is always about character growth. As I said before, we never spell out what Dream is thinking. He is an enigma up until the end. Like, always wonder what he's up to, why he's doing things, and it works because the character is the important part. And all of Sandman's world building is based around the character. One thing to remember about this is that Sandman was really a product of its time. Sandman had concluded years before Sanderson invented noted the 4 rules of magic, being is that it needs to be hard, you need to understand it. This brought in a whole hardening of magic systems in especially epic fantasy, and so that we kind of expect now to understand the magic and what's going on with it, but this really wasn't going on in the 80s and 90s when Sandman came out. Also remember that that this was there's the magic in it, and the world is much more like the 60s style of, like, it's very mysterious, very wonderful, kind of weird, and it's just to, give a sense of strange of other, which is why we read fantasy in the first place, but it wasn't there to solve the problems unless it was about character growth. Please review your soft magic systems to understand how character growth can be used, or soft magic can be used for character growth. Anyways, also remember that Sandman was part of the British Invasion, which is part of the Vertigo imprint of DC, which was a reaction to the mainstream comics that were going on in the 90s, especially the early 90s. It was all about extreme, everything was getting bigger, comics had become like collector's items. Like, X-Men had like four covers, fold out, hologram covers, whatever, and everyone was buying them as collector's items. And it was, Superman was based on like the world's biggest bodybuilder and had like even bigger muscles than normal, and that's kind of how the stories were. They were really bigger, more extreme, and it basically bankrupted Marvel, by the way. But in reaction to that, there was this wonderful imprint called Vertigo, which is of the comics I still keep, or most of them, and it was being headed by a lot of Brits at the time. Gaiman, Grant Morrison, what's his name, who did Hellblazer, who I'm blanking on, Grant Ennis, who did Preacher, and so these, really cool series, but they were also kind of smaller and removed from the universes themselves. They were their own imprint. Sandman, worked its way into the DC universe. Someone showed a picture of Darkseid in an episode, Martian Manhunter, that kind of thing. Superman and Batman have sort of cameos, but they were still off on their own, and these were much more personal stories, much weirder stories, with more depth, if you will. And this is also a product of the 90s in that they, a lot of these titles were eponymous, like Preacher, Sandman, Hellblazer, which was basically John Constantine, and they were all swimming in Alan Moore's wake from what he did a little earlier in Swamp Thing, which again, eponymous. And this was all about the characters, which is again what I was saying about Sandman. They looked at the characters, that's what it was about. So these were more personal stories about personal growth, and it was a mood, and which is another thing that was important. The 90s were really big about eschewing genres and norms and that kind of thing. If you look at just a second, got a baby. So someone's being an absolute fussbutt, and I've got like 10 minutes before I have to go pick up my other child from the school. So we're gonna try to see if we can sum up the 90s in like 3 minutes. Anyways, as I was saying, the 90s was a very kind of special time in that genres were being eschewed, and people were just kind of throwing the rules out the window, which isn't quite true because they understood the rules. This was in a lot of things, like in movies. Tarantino and Kevin Smith are like great exemplars of the indie scene that became 90s movies and emulated for years and years to come. They were part of the rise of or the death of film schools and the rise of video, because they could rent whatever movie they wanted. They were no longer beholden to going to film school to be taught how to make movies. They just got cheap equipment, knew all the conventions from having been self-taught, and then went out and filmed them stuff themselves. In the music, and again, I'm basically referring to alternative white person culture because that's what I was a part of, so that's what I'm going to speak to as knowledgeable of it. There was independent music still, independent radio stations, so you could have a Seattle scene that could get airplay, same with an Atlanta scene, I think it was Atlanta, Georgia, REM, all that. Anyways, the Midwest, the Replacements, that kind of thing, even though that was in the 80s. Anyways, there were things could develop independently but would still become mainstream. This was the 90s in music. Alternative rock was the last time that indie music, critics and mainstream audiences agreed on everything, where the critics were like, this is good music, and mainstream was like, yes, I'll put money to that. Later, mainstream's like, I'll put money to that, and critics were like, that's pretty terrible music. Anyways, so this was all going on in the 90s, just drawing from a whole bunch of other stuff, grabbing what you wanted, putting it all together, making it into a new mix. This is what Sandman was, in essence. Myth, urban fantasy, horror, just all sorts of stuff. back to the British invasion, all of these titles that were out there were really eponymous. Preacher, Sandman, again, Constantine, even though it wasn't called Constantine, Swamp Thing, they were all about a specific hero, and this was very much part of the 90s thing. In the 90s, we were all about two things, angst and being cool. And that's what a lot of these titles are. Like Preacher in particular, he's just the coolest guy in the world, but man, he feels bad. Sandman, same thing. This is, kind of why we enjoyed these heroes. It was all about the things that we did. As the Simpsons put it, like in the 90s, you couldn't feel things. We made a feeling, whatever. Sorry, we made whatever a feeling. The one thing you could show your feelings about was art, and what you felt. Then you could show it as long as it was art, like back at Reality Bites, that kind of thing. So. Anyways, that's, to me, what Sandman is an outgrowth of that. It is all about the character, not knowing the character, how much he is a black box, and trying to get into his headspace. And finally, another editor note, it's one of the things about being a product of its time is it's kind of grandfathered in, same way that Lord of the Rings, you wouldn't start a novel now with 2 chapters of world building, a long essay on what a hobbit is and their whole species. I mean, you start with a punch nowadays, but same sort of thing. And in Sandman, you don't start the whole story with a whole issue with barely having the main character in it, but one of the things that to take in mind is that these, being a product of the time, they're kind of grandfathered in, as in, not in a way that they are bad, they still stand up on their own. The more kind of a cornerstone that things have been reacting to, and the shoulders of giants that everyone else is stepping on to be taller. So product of its time, keep that in mind and how that relates to it. So the first takeaway from all this is why the world building works for Sandman, even though it's so soft. World building is one of the 4 pillars of genre fiction, fantasy in particular. Prose, characters, plot, and world building for me. Showing the impossible. Check out the first chapter in the book if you want to know more. And what we learned, it can be soft as the author can fake it, as long as the author knows it, or at least pretends to know. Author authority means that you can have a very soft world as long as the characters seem to understand that the rules are to it, and the author does. You can kind of push your way through it, especially if it's all about character growth. The world building is there to reflect the character. Or it can also be the plot. This is, as I point out, this is actually really tightly plotted. There's a whole much in Sandman that is already there that's going to pay off years and years down the line. So again, tightly plotted, tightly charactered. So the world building doesn't have to be as strong as long as it supports those other things. As has been pointed out, a world can exist without a story, but a story can't exist without a world. That's the irony, is that you want to build a world that looks like it is independent of the story, even though the world was designed to create the story. That's Sandman to a T. The world is there for the character. So the first takeaway before we do any big spoilers is to do your own thing. It took 30 years to get to the screen. Same with Lord of the Rings. How many years before it became really popular? Not like Harry Potter, but so it takes a while, a generation sometimes, for something to get big. So if you're going to do your own thing, you can't expect immediate success, but if it's good, if it's quality, people will come. All right, so that is all stuff to keep in mind. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope all of this case study on Sandman helps you to build some better worlds. All right, special spoiler ending. This is the end and all be all kind of thing. If you haven't read the series, we're about to blow a major point, so fingers in the ears or stop watching now. And that is Dream dies. Dream dies, and by his own machinations, and that's part of that being the unknowable character. You never know exactly what he's doing or what he's planning until the very end, and it's really kind of cool. But as I was saying about the world needing to support the character, that's where I think it kind of breaks down, which is why, as much as I love Sandman, as much as Gaiman was a huge influence on me, and not just as a writer, but as a person, and just a great guy, when, he has a really soft world, and as such, I don't think it actually supports any non-Sandman character, which is what's kind of interesting since it has been picked up and kind of put back into the universe. Snyder, I think his name's Snyder, was doing Dark Metal, and the new Dream shows up in it, and it's talking to Batman and Superman. It just doesn't work. Like this universe is supposed to be kind of separate, even though Darkseid shows up at Dream's funeral next to Shaggy and Scooby-Doo from Scooby-Doo. Like, it's weird. Anyways, same thing is, as much as I like Kieran Gilroy, his work on Die and the X-Men run, like, really great stuff. At the same time, did not enjoy the comic run, the new kind of spin-off on Dream. It's the dreaming, after Dream, and it doesn't hold up in my opinion. I bring all the characters back, but the world and the story doesn't support it without the main character itself, which is, to me, shows that the world building is secondary to the character. So that's the real takeaway. If you're going to do, your world building that is based around character, entirely around character, the character is a cornerstone, and once you remove it, the world building is going to fall apart a little bit. Yeah.